It's so nice to see so many of you here today. So we were really happy to see that we had more than 104 people registered, and we have already 51 person already in the meeting. So we're very happy about this. So I see some familiar faces and some new uh, persons that I don't know. So please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Um, so that we get to know you a little bit. Thanks again for taking the time to join us. Before we begin, I was just the usual quick ground rules so that we can all enjoy the session. So please keep your microphones off during the discussion so that we can avoid the background noise when our panelists will be speaking. But we'd really love to see you, so please keep your cameras on if possible, so that this helps create a sense of being in the same room together, as much as possible. So the event is recorded, but we will edit out your faces if needed, so you don't need to worry about this. So feel free to use the chat as much as you want to share your reflections and questions at any time. We will have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the panel, so you can both write your questions in the chat and we will read them to the panelists, or if you feel brave enough and wanting to interact with us, you can raise your hand and ask the questions directly. Um, Now I think I've said all the rules of the game and we can start. And let me start by introducing myself. For those of you who don't know me, so I'm Elena Gaiotto and I'm interim regranting manager here at WWP. I've been working here for 3 years now, and I've just recently taken on the role of this managing these grants. It was Ola's role. Now she's on maternity leave, so I've taken over. For those of you who don't know us, just a quick recap on who we are. So WWP is an umbrella organization which is focused on ending violence against women by working with perpetrators to stop their violent behavior. We are a network organization. We have over 70 members in more than 30 European countries, and our members include perpetrator programs, but also victim support services and researchers. The key of WWP in all its activities is ensuring that perpetrator work is one, victim centered, two, effective, and three, safe. How do we do this? For once, we have developed, as you may know, the European standards for perpetrator work. And these standards tell us how we should work in perpetrator programs so that we can ensure the best quality of the work that we do and enhance the safety of the victims, because that is the goal of all perpetrator work that we do. But also WWP, we do a lot of research activities on all different aspects that involve gender-based violence and perpetrator work. Just to give you an example, in this moment, our colleagues are working on a research on online perpetrator work. And the question is how we can take the work that we do in person and take it to the online world in a way that is safe and effective again. As you might know, in WWP, we do a lot of training and capacity building activities. And just to let you know, in the upcoming month, we will have two big events. One will be on September 25th and 26th. We will do a training focused on violence against older women, and we will focus specifically on how perpetrator programs can make a difference on this topic. And we will give you the link in the chat. So please, join this training because it's going to be very interesting. Another big event that it's coming soon is our annual conference, which will be online this year. And during the annual conference, we will talk about cyber violence, but also we will talk about online perpetrator work and the new trending topic, unfortunately, which is the manosphere and incels and how these topics are affecting young boys. But we will also talk about new and innovative ways to bring forward an idea of positive masculinity in the work that we do. And we will post the link in the chat as well. So please join us. It will be very interesting. Other activities that we do at WWP are European projects, and we love doing projects because each project helps us develop and test new methodologies that we can then bring into perpetrator work. And lastly, we do a lot of policy and advocacy activities. But one of the most recent activities that we do, which is why we're here today, is that in 2023, we started offering small grants to our members that are perpetual programs or national networks. And we give these small grants to help programs and networks strengthen their practice so that they are more in line with the European standards. In these 3 years, we have funded 25 projects. And just to let you know, in 2025, the grant was up to 30,000 euros, which is not, it's not bad. It's quite a good amount to work on some aspects of the perpetual work. So through these grants, as WWP, we're really trying to do two things at the same time. On one hand, we want to help programs strengthen or adjust some aspects of their work so that they are better aligned with the European standards. And uh, on the other hand, we know that public funding, both Europe at EU level and at national level, is becoming scarcer and scarcer. It's difficult, to have enough resources to run perpetual programs. So the grants that we offer are also meant to support programs in sustaining their everyday operation, the everyday work, which is fundamental. Um, for those programs who are already a bit more advanced, so their practice is a bit more aligned with the standards, the grants can also serve as an opportunity to go through the accreditation process. And this is a way to be formally recognized as quality, programs with a good commitment. So just to let you know, because we believe that these grants are really important for perpetual programs to develop their practice. We will open our next call for proposals in January, and it will only be open for 1 month, I think. So please check our newsletters, the websites, the social media to see when it will open and when it will close. And if you have any question, you can write directly to me, write me an email, and I give you all the information. So I've been talking about these grants, but what are these grants about? What do these projects focus on? So mainly they cover all the aspects of the standards. They reflect what, the pillars of the standards. So for example, we have programs that are doing a lot of advocacy activities and capacity building with institutions to promote safe perpetual work in their country. We have other programs like the NAIA Association, which I will introduce later. They are developing strong collaboration processes with victim support services. Other organizations are building a reliable partner contact practice, and this is all to ensure to enhance survivor safety. Other organizations, other grantees like CAM, and we will introduce them later, are improving the risk assessment procedures. And they're doing this through research, but also through developing tools to assess recidivism in the practice. Other grantees, like for example in Czech Republic and in Slovenia, are using the grants to translate the risk assessment tools into their language. So, for example, both colleagues in Slovenia and Czech Republic have translated the DASH questionnaire into their language so that they can start using it in the practice. Other activities that are covered, that are done through the grants are, one is the strengthening of the perpetual work itself, such as, for example, an organization in Slovenia is testing the co-facilitation during group sessions. So for the first time, they have introduced male and female facilitators, and this is really improving their practice. And other programs are enhancing the methodology of the program, and they are defining admission and exclusion criteria. So you see that all these aspects that the projects are working on are very concrete, very practical, and they really serve in improving the program. Now, and this is the reason why we're here today, Some of our grantees, like NAIA and CAM, are focusing on how to introduce gender perspective into their practice. And gender perspective is not an optional extra, something flashy and new that we introduce, but it's a core principle stated in the European standards that I've been mentioning. And the standards underline that perpetrator work cannot be seen in isolation from the wider context of gender inequality. So we know that the standards remind us that violence it's not just a series of isolated acts, but violence is part of a system when men's violence against women is rooted in inequality power relations and harmful social norms. So we know that if programs only work on behavior without addressing these dynamics, they risk missing the deeper causes and they fail to protect the survivors, which is the ultimate goal of everything that we do in programs. So this is why the standards ask to programs ask them to make gender perspective visible in every aspect of the work, starting from risk assessment and then going into how we structure group sessions, how we collaborate with victim support services, but also how we speak with men about responsibility, accountability, and change. So when we work on gender perspective, we really are working at the heart of what makes a perpetual program safe, effective, and aligned with the standards, but also with the commitments of bigger documents like the Istanbul Convention. So, and that's exactly why we're here today, because we want to look more closely at this idea of gender perspective, not just in theory, but also in practice. And to do that, we have, asked a fantastic panel of experts to come talk about this with us. So you will see that we have two experts who have been working for years on gender and violence prevention, but we also have colleagues from two programs that are right now introducing gender perspective into their work, thanks to the WWP grant. And I believe that these people together bring both, the theoretical lens, but also the lived experience of adaptive services to the ground. So now I've said enough. So let me start introducing our four panelists. So the first one is Heinrich Geldschläger. Heinrich is the Director of Research and International Project at Conexus Association in Barcelona. And Heinrich is psychologist and psychotherapist. Hi, Heinrich, welcome. Then we have Gill McKinna, who is the head of the Caledonian System National Team. Hi, Jill, welcome. We have Rossano Bisciglia, psychologist and psychotherapist. Rossano is vice president of CAM in Florence. Ciao, Rossano. And last but not least, we have not one but two people from the Association NAIA in Bulgaria. We have Svetla Sivcheva, who is the chairperson of the board at the association, and she is a clinical social worker with a lot of experience in this work. And we have Nina Nikolova, who is the director of the Victim Support Service. And Nina is a journalist, so she brings this communication experience and expertise in doing advocacy work. So welcome to both of you, and welcome to the four of you. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. So just to open the conversation, I'd like to start with a very simple but fundamental question, because I've been talking about gender perspective a lot. So Jill, I want to ask you, in the end, what do we really mean when we talk about gender perspective in perpetrator work?
Hi everyone, it's lovely to see you, and it was so nice to see so many of you last week at the European Conference on Domestic Violence in Barcelona. So hello again. And in answer to your question, I think what we need to recognise is that domestic abuse is generally accepted as gender-based violence, and it refers to the mistreatment of someone because of their gender. So feminist theory highlights the connection between gender and violence, and it notes that men are overwhelmingly the perpetrators of all types of violence in the world, and domestic violence is no exception to this rule. And there was research committed by the World Health Organization in 2022, so just a few years ago, highlighting that almost 1 in 3 women will experience some form of domestic abuse and violence in their lifetime, and that'll be perpetuated by an intimate or ex-intimate male partner. So the gender perspective recognises that the vast majority of domestic violence is committed by men and it's experienced by women. And this stems from unequal power and privilege distributions across society. So what we know is that culture defines gender roles, and some customs, traditions, and religions are often used to justify violence against women and girls, particularly when women and girls transgress these culturally assigned roles that have been landed upon them. So basically, I suppose in summary, the gender perspective enables us to have an understanding of who is doing what to who and why, and it also assists in understanding that men's abuse of women takes place in a gender unequal society. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. So yeah, you talked about how violence is really rooted in inequality and social norms. And Heinrich, I want to take, one step further with you, and I want to ask you, why is it essential that perpetrator programs make this perspective explicit? And so when we say that we need to have gender-informed programs, what does that actually look like in practice?
Yeah, thank you, Elena. It's a pleasure to do this together with our dear colleagues Jill and Rossano and Svetlana from NAIA. Yeah, there's not much to add about why it is essential really to what Jill mentioned, because we have this structural power relations between men and women in our societies and the social norms and stereotypes around genders that shape and influence our identities and our behaviors. And these are key factors in producing men's violence in relationships with other men, with themselves, but especially also with women and children. And with around the gender norms and stereotypes, of course, especially important is to have a look at masculinities. And there has been some interesting research summarizing what we know about the link between traditional masculinities and male violence against women. Just a few years ago, a meta-analysis clearly showed this link. And as Jill said, that's why it's called gender-based violence. That's why our WWP standards require perpetrator programs to include this gender perspective, specifically regarding the program goals, approach, and content. So what does that mean to us? Incorporating a gender perspective or a gender-informed approach means, on the one hand, the victim safety orientation in the structure and the processes of the work, apart from the partner contact and support and the coordination with the victim support services, which are, of course, paramount. It means to us that we constantly ask ourselves, how does my intervention, how does what I do with the man impact in the victim survivors, in the partners, and in the children, especially if I have doubts about how to go on and what to do. But it also means exploring this influence of the social norms around gender and specifically around masculinity in the production of the men's identities and in their use of violence in a transversal way, really. When we look at their experiences of using violence or when they started or changed their use of violence in their life course. So we'll talk a bit more later on. But also including the intersection of these masculinity norms or their influence in other important risk factors, such as emotion regulation, trauma, or substance use, for example. And it also means to invite men to trace how they have been recruited or socialized into adhering to these norms around masculinity and genders, and the consequences this has had on their relationships with their partners and children mainly, but also with other women and men and with themselves. And then to create spaces for them to explore and embrace alternative notions of masculinities, alternative ways of being men, and alternative ways, consequently, of relating to others.
Thank you so much, Heinrich. You pointed out how it's masculinity norms shape the way that men use violence, and I think Rossano, you have a lot of experience in this work, and I think that resonates also with the work that you do at CAM, and CAM has a long history. It was the first program that opened in Italy in 2009, so you have a long history of work. So I'm curious about what made you decide now that it was the right time to strengthen the gender perspective in your curriculum.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. My thanks to WWP for this kind invitation. So in Italy, we decided to review our gender-oriented curriculum for two main reasons, one practical and one political. The first reason is about effectiveness. Violence does not come only from individual problems, but develops within a broader cultural context. If we want to reduce reoffending, we must, of course, stop the violence and keep the victim safe, but we also need to work on cultural change. This means helping the man to understand that his behavior is not just the result of a moment of anger, but is roots in a power dynamics. For example, we must work on gender stereotypes. In Italy, these stereotypes are still very strong. A man must be dominant and women must be caring and compliant. These beliefs deeply influence how men live their relationship and, in some cases, create a fertile ground for violent behavior. We must be careful because it often happens that men declare themselves in favor of gender equality and respectful toward women. When they feel under pressure, they use violence as a tool to manage conflict. Many do not recognize this behavior as violent, but as a form of self-defense. The second reason is, in my opinion, political. In recent years, the issue of gender-based violence has attracted the attention of psychology and many important psychologists in Italy. The risk is that intervention become too focused on psychological aspect, neglecting the cultural dimension. This is why we believe it is important to make our voice heard, to emphasize that the roots of violence are not only individual, but also social and culture.
Thank you, Rossano. So the work that you're doing is not at the individual level, but it's more broad on cultural level. And Nina and Svetla, so how about things in Bulgaria? So what motivated you to take this step, and how has the context in Bulgaria influenced the way that you bring gender into your program?
Hello, I am very glad to see all of you. Thank you, Elena, for this invitation, for this chance to present, to share our practice, and to exchange different ideas on the topic, how to implement gender perspective in working with perpetrators. So, for the past 6 years, we have been conducting regular internal and external monitoring of our perpetrator program. We have 3 reports prepared by external experts. Two of them are based on analysis of the impact questionnaires conducted by the European Network for Working with Perpetrators. The last one from the last year is from the Accreditation Committee, after you were one of the organizations that pilot tested the accreditation process of the European standards. As a result of this annual monitoring and conversations with perpetrators, victims, and representatives of institutions with whom we partner in implementing the program, we have realized that as a framework, our program in its essence, goals, and principles reflects the gender perspective. Moreover, over 11 years of experience, we have accumulated serious expertise in working mainly with men who commit violence in intimate relationships against their female partners and their children. These are 95% of our clients in the program. We also have good practice and very serious achievements in addressing the parental role of perpetrators, and these topics are covered in an integral component of the sessions. Perhaps we have not been able to fully develop our program as a narrowly specialized one, because the Bulgarian specialized law on protection against domestic violence is gender neutral, and according to the regulations and the Bulgarian minimum standards for perpetrator programs, these programs are for dealing with anger and aggression. However, the practice shows otherwise. The clients of these programs in the vast majority of cases are men, perpetrators of violence in intimate relationships against their female partners. This is a motivation for us to work on further developing our program, strengthening the work on gender issues in sessions with perpetrators, and presenting to other institutions, including the referring district courts, with a focus on gender inequalities and stereotypes that generate violence against women. Thank you. My colleague Tina can add something else.
Yes, maybe I can add two key points in my opinion. Our practice in working with perpetrators shows that these men have been using violence against their intimate female partners in all its forms for years. And in some cases, this client has had aggressive behavior in previous intimate relationships, and the abuse continues in the current one. And intimate partner violence is a pattern of abusive behavior for them, not isolated accident, not outburst of anger from frustration, pain, or stress. And we cannot expect effectiveness. Sorry. We cannot expect effectiveness if we work with these men only on controlling their anger and aggression, because they usually show good skills in controlling anger when they are at work, when they are among other men. And seeking effectiveness in the treatment of perpetrators, more than a client coming to 27 sessions and not dropping out of the program, we decide to revise the content of the sessions and make it more gender sensitive and clearly linked male violence with power, control, and gender inequality. And one note, a gender perspective in working with perpetrators. I think it is closely related to motivation of perpetrators to change, because we know that our perpetrators are with strong resistance and minimization of aggression behavior, because they are in a context of an involuntary program that we are implementing in Bulgaria. And perpetrators strongly defend their beliefs because they are the subject of messages justify inequality. And we are motivated to work on these models and patterns and deconstruct them so that we can expect effective impact and change of violent behavior.
Thank you so much, Nina and Svetla, for your thorough answer. And I think it's interesting to see that, you know, all four of you, we have talked about, you know, you have given us different perspectives, but, you know, in the end, we have understood that this gender lens that we want to apply to preparatory work is essential because we have understood that violence stems from inequality and from cultural and societal norms that we have in our spaces. And we know that these dynamics show up in our daily practice. We see them when we work with perpetrators. So now we have talked a lot about the why. Let's talk a little bit about the how. So Heinrich, I want to start with you and ask you, what methods or tools have you found that are most effective for engaged men in discussion about gender, power, and masculinity?
Yeah, thank you. There's different ways of working around gender, masculinities, and it's linked to the use of violence. More direct ones, where we work with the men around what being a man means to them, what masculinity means to them, how they have learned about masculinity, how they have been sanctioned maybe, or been bullied if they didn't comply or fulfill the social norms around masculinity. We sometimes use videos around that work. But what's really more interesting to us, actually, and that has to do with what Nina just said about the anger issues, is to help men, assist men in understanding their experience of anger, their use of violence, and the meaning or the intentionality that oftentimes lies behind the anger that they feel or the violence that they use. So a lot of our work has to do with describing and talking about episodes that men explain about the violence they used, and we might ask them questions about what made you so angry when your partner, for example, didn't have dinner on the table when you came home, or didn't want to have sex with you, and why, or when you did stop assaulting or beating or insulting her, what had happened and why did you stop? And sometimes they say, I lost control, but then they do stop at some point usually. And sometimes it's when she just shut up, or when she finally did what I expected her to do. Or when we do biographical work on the onset of the use of violence, or changes in the use of violence, which are often related to significant life events or to changes in the couple's life cycle. For example, when a child is being born, how do you explain that? And often what we find when we do this work on the violent episodes or this biographical work is that behind the anger, behind the use of violence, there are traditional notions of masculinity in different ways. The first one, most important, most blunt, probably, that many men in our service, at least, which is has been a voluntary service, would probably not admit to, is that of male power and privilege, which means that some men feel entitled to hold a position of power, of superiority with respect to their partner, with respect to women in general, that they feel entitled to demand or receive services from them, from their partners, domestic services, sexual, and even emotional, and that they have the right to use violence and abuse to obtain or maintain or reestablish this position of power or these services. Other times, violence is more a reaction to threats that men perceive to their masculine identity. These can be internal threats. So the masculine identity traditionally is based on performance, on the compliance of the different norms of masculinity, commandments to be strong, be the best, always know what to do or to say, be in control of the situation, but also of yourself. Do not show vulnerability or emotions related to vulnerability, etc., etc. And non-compliance to these norms easily leads to feelings of failure, inferiority, inadequacy, insecurity, helplessness, and shame, importantly, or even fear in the man. And these in turn are unacceptable according to this traditional model of masculinity. And then violence is sometimes used to overturn these unacceptable feelings, to recover a sense of power and control, even if momentarily. And here, rather a control over oneself and one's feelings than over the partner. But sometimes it's also more external threats to that masculine identity by construing within this model the partner as an object or as an extension of myself, rather than as a legitimate other with their own inner life, which is different to mine, but equivalent with the same worth. This leads many men to a difficulty to tolerate difference of opinions, of preferences, of desires, of needs, sometimes even of emotional states. And then violence is sometimes used to make these differences disappear, to impose my own opinion or preference, and to return the partner to that status of an object. And also there's a pathway from masculinity to the use of violence through the difficulties in emotional regulation, in identifying, understanding, and expressing their own emotions, their inner processes, and the tendency to delegate the responsibility for their own feelings to the partner, which might then also lead to emotional dependency on the partner in some men, especially if there's already some insecure attachment issues going on, and often leads to jealousy or fear of abandonment, which is mostly unrelated to the partner's real behavior. And then instead of understanding this jealousy as my own issue of insecurity, of fear, of dependency, and trying to address it and do something about it, the responsibility is delegated to the partner, who's then often controlled, coerced, often now digitally, into behaving in a way that calms my feelings of jealousy, of fear, of insecurity, and at the same time somehow compensates this inadmissible feelings of dependency. And another issue that's important, I don't know if I have time to reflect a bit on that, has to do with the importance of our self-reflection as facilitators on our own gendered beliefs and on our performance of gender in our work, especially the effects on the therapeutic relationship or working relationship. And you've mentioned the male-female facilitator diets. There it is especially important in this co-gender work to really have a balanced co-gender team that avoids representing stereotypes. So the woman worker as the assistant, who's possibly less active or maybe more confronting, addressing emotional issues, being empathic. And the male worker maybe be more active or more rational, theoretic, or sometimes protective of the female worker. So that's important to avoid these kind of stereotypes, and that requires a high awareness of their own gendered experience here. And also the invitations that we might receive from the men, for example, trying to seduce the male worker into bonding or to isolate the female workers. So it's important to have strategies in place to counter these possible tendencies. Male workers, for example, can use disclosure of own experiences and talk inclusively in ways that probably female workers couldn't. And it's important to avoid that the female workers somehow represented in the group, idealized or demonized as women's voice or the women's representation in general in the group. So the joint planning and debriefing of sessions, team reflection, supervision are really important to be aware of our own performing of genders in the work with men and how it affects the men and the groups.
I would say, wow, Heinrich, you really gave us a lot of examples that are great strategies and really examples that shed a light on perpetrators' behavior and how it is linked again to gender and masculinity. So I think that we can all take inspiration from what you said and think about how we can do this in our own practice. But Gill, picking up from what Heinrich said, what are some practical tips and strategies that you found especially useful for bringing gender into the room with men?
Yeah, no problem. And a lot of this will be similar to what Heinrich was saying. But first off, I would like to highlight that it's really important that you work with men as men. And what I mean by that is recognising that they are products of society, and that is what you're working with in the room. And when discussing the change process, because that's what we're trying to help men do, isn't it? Change their behaviour. When discussing change in relation to gender, there was some research carried out back in 2016, and what that was highlighting was that the main stimulus of self-determination for women is generally the family's welfare. And the main stimulus for men is status and achievement in society. And workers need to understand this when helping men through their perpetrator programs. So, for example, right, men are generally taught how to deal with problems by finding a solution. Women are generally taught to deal with problems by talking about it with their friends or their family. And if you ask men how they think or feel about a particular event, what they'll tend to do is say what they did in response to it. And as I said, women learn to talk things over and want to just discuss problems before deciding on a solution. And just telling men about this difference and how you can approach things can be very illuminating. So that's sort of like the first tip, I would say. And whilst the programme that you're using should encourage men to consider the impact and the social constructs of masculinity and its contribution to their abusive behaviour, it's also really important that you acknowledge the positive aspects of masculinity, because it's absolutely, it's not binary. And this is crucial. And it's important that you do not demonise men in your programme and demonise them when incorporating a gendered perspective into your intervention. So we also need to recognise, though, that men need to feel that any changes that they make are manly and that they're seen to be so by other men in the group. And I think that's really important. And as Heinrich was saying, co-gendered facilitation of groups is, I would say, the gold standard. It models effective communication between men and women and can really help start tackling gendered stereotypes. And if you're looking for things, actual activities that you can do in your group to really bring gender into it, it can be quite helpful if you use a timeline of events that have happened in your country to explore the impact that this has had on both men and women. So, for example, wars. If wars have occurred in your country, what's the impact on men and women been? Any legislative changes that have come into place, higher education changes or access to higher education, sporting events, and how they have an impact on society. That can be a really quite a fun exercise and gentle way to bring in discussions around how men and women do experience things very differently. Another tip you could do is to talk through a pre-prepared scenario that involves a man and a woman. So it could be them going out on a date, or it could be them applying for a new job, whatever, but talk through a scenario and have half of the group explore what's going on from the man's perspective, and the other half of the group talk through what might be going through it from the female's perspective. We have found that to be a really helpful piece of work in the Caledonian system. We've also found that it's quite helpful to explore how the expectations that we have on men and women in today's society, and compare it with the expectations of, say, in the 1970s, and discuss how things have changed, how they've got better or perhaps worse. So areas that you could explore are any changes that have occurred in relation to childcare responsibilities, or household chores, or socialising with friends, or family finances. So that can be a really nice and helpful exercise to do as well. Thank you.
Sorry, there's a microphone
They didn't
on.
put it for you.
Yes, Dora, can you please check? So thank you, Jill. Again, you gave us a lot of great insights and example, and I think it's interesting that's how you reminded us that often men need to see change as manly in order to embrace it. And this really, it challenges the way that we sometimes think about perpetrator work, because it's not just about telling men to stop, but it's about offering them a different picture of what being a man can look like without demonizing them, as you were mentioning. And again, if these new behaviors that they adopt are seen as weak or not masculine enough, they might, be resistant to this change. So I think this is a really interesting perspective that you brought. So now I want to, ask Naya and Nina and Svetla. So because in the work that you're doing now, thanks to the WWP grant, how are you planning to introduce gender perspective into your program? And so I don't know if you have think about sessions or exercise that you want to bring in to this new with this new perspective.
Yeah, I will present you only our ideas because we haven't tasted it in the program at all. So we plan to introduce a special panel of 5 or 6 sessions in which first we would identify the stereotypes of masculinity that a client carries under the influence of society, public expectations, and prejudices. These are the hard models that form his basic values and attitudes. We would use 20 statements that reflect stereotypical expectations. For example, a man should earn more money than a woman. A man should not show weakness, etc. like this. We would offer a backpack to the client in which he could put those expectations that he would accept as valid for him, as well as the opportunity to add others. Then the consultant would tell him that it is heavy to carry this backpack with so many expectations all the time, and would begin to discuss each of the statements, asking the client what benefits this expectation brings him and what the negatives are. At the end, the client would have the right to lose some of the baggage load. Then we plan to work on the personal history of this client and the reflection of public attitudes towards masculinity in his personal history. We thought of using a technique called egg, where at the top of the egg, the client would place the most important things for him as a man, what he would like to be, what he thinks is important, and what makes him a real man. We could ask additional questions. When and how he understood that these things are important for a man. Who told him or showed him? Does anyone else think that these things are very important for a man? What benefits these things bring to his life? In the middle of the part of GEC, the client would place the characteristics of masculinity that are neutral, neither important nor unimportant, and at the bottom, those that would be least important to him and would be given up. Then we could turn the egg over and would ask the client what he sees now and what he thinks about this man for whom things are arranged like this. We ask him if he sometimes happens to be such a man. Would he like to be such a man? Who would support him if he was such a man? Who would sanction him if he was such a man? How would his life change? With this technique, we would work on the client's personal history in terms of the gender perspective. This is for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think you have a great plan in place. And I will like, I'm partial to it, but it shows how WWP grants really open spaces also for creativity in the organization, because it really helps you develop the practice in the best way possible. So now, Rossano, you are in the same position as NAIA. You've been, starting with this thanks to the grant, and you have been experimenting new ways of working with men at CAM. So can you give us, walk us through examples of how you are doing it in your practice?
Yes, I need to make a premise. When we work with our groups, we often discuss their violent behavior in a confrontational way. Many men feel a sense of injustice when they are judged or for their actions. In my view, this confrontation can be harmful, especially in the first month of work. At this stage, men don't yet have tools to question or reflect on their behavior. That is why I believe it is more effective to focus first on the culture and social aspect. These shape their actions. The aim is simple. They plant a different seed to sow that in time a different plant may grow. For this reason, we have developed a specific session on social and cultural context every 3 or 4 meetings. These sessions are designed to be experiential and engaging. For example, we have a session on gender stereotypes. This session is structured like a funnel. We start with the general categories and gradually move toward more personal situations. This helps lower defenses and makes men more open to reflection. At the start, participants walk around the room, for example. The facilitator asks them to say the first word that's come to mind when they hear, for example, Italians or French. Then they exchange words with the other group members until somebody says their original word back to them, and then they sit down. Typical stereotypes appear. For example, Italians equals mafia, French equals arrogant. These are written on the blackboard. The group reflects on how people often categorize others. The facilitator highlights how categories can be useful because they simplify reality, but also limiting. The exercise is repeated with the categories like men and women, leading to a discussion about consequence of over-categorization. At this point, the idea of gender stereotypes is introduced. The second part, at this point, the focus shifts to difficulty of living inside the box of stereotypes. Some questions include: what's happened to a man who doesn't show trait considered masculine? What's happened to a woman who shows traits considered masculine? Often participants replay: a man who cries is weak, or a woman who plays football is a lesbian. The goal is not to make men feel guilty or force them to change immediately, but to open their minds to new insight. Another example is a privileged session. The men are divided in two groups, men and women, standing in a line. The facilitators makes statement about freedom, safety, respect, and opportunities. For example, I can walk alone at night in my city without fear. If it's true, step forward. If not, step back. At the end, the different position in the room make visible the inequalities between men and women. It is very powerful. The last session, for example, is a social permission for violence. This session explores how violence is tolerated, justified, and even celebrated in society. It is not always directly linked to gender, but strongly shapes how people relate to one another. We highlight everyday normalized situation. For example, violence in stadiums, insult among politicians, parents encouraging children to respond with anger, media models that glorify the strong and dominant male, common language that mocks or devalues vulnerability. This session is still a work in progress. We are exploring the best way to structure it for the group. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rossano. You really gave us really practical examples of really concrete exercises that we can do with men in the group sessions. And I think this goes perfectly well with what Heinrich and Gill said earlier about, they talked more about the more theoretical part, and you gave us the examples, and NAIA is also, with their planning. So it's really, our conversation is really shaping up to be really helpful because we have everything, all the elements to carry on. But as exciting as these new methods are, and bringing in this new gender perspective into perpetrator work isn't always easy. It's not as easy as it seems. And Heidi, from your experience across different contexts, what are the most common challenges that programs face when trying to integrate gender? Because it's not just introduced as a value on paper, but in the actual content and facilitation of sessions.
Yeah, thank you. That's really great to hear about these very creative ways and initiatives that both programs are starting or expanding their work on gender in their programs. Fantastic. I think the main challenges are probably related to us as facilitators and to the men, apart from the methodology. I think to be able to spot and address these different connections between the notions of masculinity, gendered beliefs and norms, and the use of violence transversely at the different stages, all different stages of the program. So we can have specific sessions to work on this, which is of course fantastic and very important. But I think it's important really to spot these connections and address them during all the work that we do in the different individual or group sessions. And that really requires a thorough understanding of these different ways these are interconnected, the masculinity norms and the violent behavior. And at the same time, it requires quite a high level of self-reflection and awareness, as we said before, of the own beliefs around genders and own performances and gendered identities and how they influence our work. So we've talked a bit before about the co-gender work in group facilitation, but I think the same really goes for the working relationship in the individual work, because there is this temptation to believe that we are different from the men that we work with, that we are somehow morally or professionally superior to them, and that we have the right or the obligation to make them stop thinking and doing what we know that they shouldn't do and think. And somehow to replicate the type of power relationships based on difference and based on superiority with the men that we really want to challenge and change. And Alan Jenkins really has beautifully written about this in his book, Becoming Ethical. That is a joint process really that we do with men we work with. And the other big challenge from our point of view has to do with resistance from men, especially if we directly and explicitly work on masculinity, power and control. And that is why we actually prefer to do most of the work on this indirectly by parting from their experience and the episodes of violence that they narrate instead of putting it on the table ourselves, because especially lately this resistance is often fueled by anti-feminist discourse influenced by the manosphere, and I'm really happy that this is going to be addressed in the next WWP conference. For example, here in Spain, some recent surveys show that more than half of young men believe that feminism has gone too far and that men are now discriminated. And 1 in 4 believe that gender-based violence doesn't exist and it's just an invention, ideological invention by feminism. And for the first time, actually, young men here in Spain have more conservative or anti-feminist views and attitudes, not only than their fathers, but than their grandfathers. So this gender gap in feminism between boys and girls and young men and women is growing. So that is a big challenge, both in the work with the men who use violence, but also in all the prevention work, especially with boys and young men that we do.
Thank you so much. So I guess that really the resistance from men could be a great challenge. And just I want to just make a comment, because I don't know if you panelists know and if you're taking a look at the chat, but there is quite a lot of contributions from the participants. So I'm really happy to see that the people are really engaged into this conversation. So I went to Nina and NAIA. Because I think that the context, the situation in every country brings their own challenges. There might be cultural resistance to gender equality and even political pushback on this. So how does this environment influence how facilitators and clients perceive gender in your program?
Definitely, Elena, it is the hardest issue for us because the local context, culture, regulations, and legislations, as well as the established practices or the lack thereof, influence the perception of the topic both by the facilitators and the clients of the program. As I mentioned earlier, the Bulgarian special law against domestic violence is gender neutral, and the Istanbul Convention was rejected at the highest level by the Bulgarian Constitutional Court in 2019. To this, we should add the target attacks on gender terminology and the deliberate replacement of the topic with that of sexual orientation, making it impossible to talk openly about gender stereotypes, gender inequalities, and gender-based violence. Unfortunately, in the Bulgarian subculture, the concept of gender is already directly associated with the gay issue. There are jokes and mockeries. Several Bulgarian films there are in this topic. This has been a major challenge for us when we have discussed how to implement this topic in the work with perpetrators. The culture itself, in the local context, and public attitudes support aggressive masculinity and power inequality between women and men. Machismo is encouraged at all levels. There are a lack of different speech in parliament by politicians, in the media, on social networks. I think that in order to successfully introduce gender issues in the program for working with perpetrators, it should reflect existing regulations, and they are known in Bulgaria. If I have to express myself figuratively, our goal is to move the perpetrator from his resistance, denial, and aggressive masculinity to respect, honor, and equal treatment with his partner, but we lack the road on which to do this. For the facilitators in the program, it is a huge challenge to participate in the process of motivating the perpetrators because they do not have the support of the external environment. They do not have the support of the clients themselves. On the contrary, they are faced with strong resistance, denial, and neglect of violence. And the clients have also a hard time. Why should they step out of this macho role that brings them power and prestige among their friends, colleagues, and society, and which is accepted as the true role of a man? Why should they turn into something else, which in our culture is called with offensive words? If a man is understanding and supportive of his partner, participates equally with her in taking care of the home and children, in Bulgaria, they say that he is a man and a sleeper, which means neckpacked man, and it is humiliating and offensive. Why should he move from one prestigious position to another, which brings him only negativity in the eyes of society? Here's our extremely difficult role: to give the client another perspective, to help him find positives in another model of communication for himself, for his self-perception, for his life, for his partner relationships, for his parental role. Considering all the limitations that I mentioned, a real challenge is to give the client a positive perspective that when he changes his behavior, he will be happier, and more successful as a man, as a person. We focus exactly on this. And Nina can add something.
Yes, I confirm what Svetla said, and we know that our program is not some island in the sea of society values, and we know that after the end of the program, this man goes out in the company of other men, other people who may be stopping the process of change and reinforcing his beliefs that men have the right to express power and control over women. There are many factors, and we, in order to minimize his negative influence, in the last session in our perpetrator program, we work with the men to prepare their own plan for future non-violence communication and relationships with their intimate partner. And in these last sessions, clients themselves put their own specific goals and note which factors, which people, which circumstances around them are supportive for this change and are resources in the process of change, but also which are these things that would hinder this process, and who are the barrier to their goals, and how to minimize these negative effects. And we think that it works well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nina and Svetla. I just want to, read you a comment that we have in the chat from Maria. She says that you really work in a very challenging environment. And Maria says that she has a lot of admiration for your tenacity and persistence. And I really want to, subscribe to that, because I've known you for many years now. And I know that you keep on working and working on this and improving despite everything and the situation that you have. So you're really doing a great job, I think, despite everything and in spite of everything. And so we have seen that for in applying gender perspective, we might have different challenges that can be the resistance from men, but it can also be the difficulties in the context. And Rossana, I want to ask you if you have encountered any resistance from the facilitators in your team when you decided to introduce all of this.
Yes. I believe there is some resistance. Many facilitators how know the gender perspective in theory, but they struggle to really bring it into practice when working with men. This happens, in my opinion, for different reasons. Some have not done personal work on themselves. They have studied the concept, but they have not really integrated them. So they cannot transmit them with authenticity. Others come from a purely psychological background, and then to see violence only as an individual problem, ignoring its culture and social roots. In some cases, there is also a lack of...
Attention all staff. This is a security announcement. All gates, with the exception of the front.
What's happened?
I don't know. You can go on. Go on, please.
Another reason is the lack of specific training on the gender perspective. It is not enough to learn about it at an academic level. What is needed in practical and continuous training on how to bring this perspective into the group, how to manage resistance, and how to stimulate new awareness. Finally, some facilitators choose the easier path, focusing on individual psychological aspects, rather than addressing the culture dynamics that are at the root of violence.
So I guess from what you have all said, the work in gender perspective is multi-layered because yes, we work on it with men in our perpetual programs, but before we do that, we have to work on that with the facilitators that work on the programs like Rosanna was mentioning, but we also need to work on it on a societal level, on a wider level, because this, as we mentioned more and more, it stems from its root causes of violence that stem from the social norms. So it's really a multi-layered approach. And I don't know, I don't want to close the webinar talking about the challenges because it's going to be a downer. But because yes, there are some challenges and difficulties, but I think that from what you all mentioned, it's worth it. We should work on it because it's worth it, really. And there are benefits in working on gender perspective and introducing it into the practice. So Jill, the last question is for you, and it's actually from your experience, what are these benefits for survivors, for the perpetrators, and for society as a whole?
Okay, I can answer this one quite succinctly. So what I believe is that if you implement a gender perspective into your perpetrator programs, it enables the conversations to take place. It enables conversations around how gendered beliefs are fostered and how they're supported by cultural traditions, which are often experienced as the norm and are often detrimental to women. So like, for example, in Scotland, rape within marriage didn't become a crime until 1989. England and Wales, it was 1991. But that wasn't that long ago. But before these dates, there was a legal presumption that existed that means a wife gave irrevocable consent to sexual activity upon marriage, meaning that a husband in this country could not be prosecuted for raping his wife. How detrimental is that to women? And it's really, if you have a gender perspective, you can have these conversations and explore how unhelpful that's been. Again, if we look at legislation that's about just now in all countries relating to paternal leave when a child is born, quite often men are prohibited time off work from spending time with their children, and that's detrimental to men. So again, having that gender perspective enables those really helpful and healthy conversations to take place. And I suppose, most importantly, see if we explore these issues, we can then start enable discussions on how motivation to detract from such entrenched beliefs can be harnessed. And that's what we're trying to do, because that will be of benefit to women, children, and men. So I suppose having this gender perspective really promotes discussion on the challenges associated with being a specific gender in society, and it helps create empathy for the other, as well as acknowledgement of the benefits that all genders can bring to society as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jill. And as you know, I'm just quoting the comment that we have in the chat from Elizabeth Gilchrist, and she said she underlines that yes, gender affects women too, and we all live with that, and we cannot ignore it. So it's not something that we should work on with men, but we need to remember it always as women as well. So thank you for that. And I want to again thank you, all of you, 5 of you, because I think that in this short conversation that we had, we really explored different concepts and theories, but also practices that we can use and apply in this, perpetrator work to really tackle these gender issues and aspects at all levels, as we said. I have a few questions for you from the chat. Now, let me find it. So, Rosanna, it's the practical question for you. So, earlier you were describing the game where you have the men in 2 lines, and half of them are men and half of them are women. So the question is, do you have men pretend to be women in this game, or do you actually have women in the game.
No, Elena, ti chiedo aiuto. Sono tutti gli uomini del gruppo, metà rimangono uomini, mentre l'altra metà diventano le donne, e in questo modo possono capire effettivamente che cosa succede nel loro sentirsi sicure all'interno della loro città. Momento, e quindi sentono quello.
Okay, so during the game, we have half the men do the men, and the other half of the men pretend to be women, so they can start to understand how it feels like to be a woman in the city, and how, you know, all the things related to security and feeling safe in the city. So, but they're all men, people who participate. Then NAIA, there was a question for you. Earlier, you were mentioning that you have developed a questionnaire, and people from the public asked if you could share the questionnaire.
Maybe the question is about our two exercise about that Svetlana presented.
About 20 statements that I said about this.
I'm not sure. That's all the question was asking about. So
Is it-
maybe for the person who asked the question, if you have any more details, we can ask NAIA.
Everyone can create the same statements like this. For example, homework is female work, not male work. Women are terrible drivers in comparison to men, like this.
Thank you. And then I have another question, and Gill and I, you decide who wants to answer. See who's the first one. So could you tell us for how many years have you integrated gender perspective in your programs, and what are the results that you see in terms of effectiveness? You can both answer this if you want.
Yeah, so in Scotland, in the Caledonian system, we have adopted a gendered perspective to our work since its inception. So for the last 16 years, we have been incorporating this approach. And one of the I suppose the main benefits, just off the top of my head, is the ability to create empathy when doing this work, and understanding the impact that gender has on, and a gendered society has on, women, children and men. So it creates that real broad understanding. And I also believe doing that really helps you prevent demonising men as well, which is important that we do that, as I was saying at the start, when I was introducing this topic. Nina, I'll pass over to you.
Yes, so we've been integrating the work on gender and specifically masculinity, I think 20 years ago, something like that. We do not have like scientific studies on the effectiveness of especially this part of the work, but in line with what Gill said, we feel it really helps men, especially this more indirect work, to understand the meaning, the sense it makes for them to use violence, why they use it, and especially what they use it for. And that helps be more effective in really changing, not only changing the use of violence, but also changing their ways of being men and relating not only to their partners and children, but also to themselves and to other people. So yeah, we do not have effectiveness studies in a scientific sense of the word, but we have a clear sense that it helps us be more effective in working with men and in helping them understand the use of violence to then change it.
Yeah, and I've just got one more thing I want to add on to what Heinrich was saying there. Also, and again, no scientific study on this, but I also believe it helps enable a space for a conversation to happen where men can actually say, are they happy with what's happening? So while society that they live in might say men should behave this way, you can have that conversation about, are you happy with it? How is that helping you out? How's that working out for you? Because you're on a perpetrator program, so something's not working well with that, and it enables that conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you, Jill, for this last closure. I have one last question, and then Rosanna, it's for you again, and it's again about the game. So the question is, but do men easily step into women's role during the games, the activities that you do?
Scusami, Elena, aiutami.
Sì, quando fate queste attività, gli uomini entrano facilmente nel ruolo delle donne?
Sì, molto facilmente.
Mm.
Assolutamente sì. E questo crea una sorta di dissonanza, perché gli permette di vedere cose che altrimenti non riconoscerebbero all'interno della loro coscienza. Ma in quel modo c'è questo meccanismo strano che se diventano le donne si legittimano quel tipo di pensiero. Però se glielo chiedi razionalmente da uomo, non lo so qual è questo meccanismo, non riesco a spiegarmelo da un punto di vista neurochimico, però succede questo. Nel momento in cui entrano nella parte D, riescono più facilmente a impersonificarsi.
So the answer to the question is yes. They easily step into the women's role when they do this kind of activities, and it really becomes very effective in the scope that we have in this. It's kind of weird and dissonating to think about this, because if you ask a man to answer a question within being a man, making a man, they will have a very rational answer to that. But when you ask them to pretend to be a woman, they enter in another mindset, and they start to really recognize what are the effects of violence or behaviors on women. So it's really useful and helpful to do this kind of activities.
Thank you, Elena.
You're welcome. Thank you, Rosanna, for the answer. So I've done the interpreter as well today. So I think so we're approaching the end of this very, very interesting conversation. And I really want to thank the 5 of you for being with us today and for bringing in your expertise and showing us how, again, how well grants work in supporting you to improve the practice. And I also want to thank all the people that stayed with us through this webinar. We had, consistently more than 80 people, and many of them were really engaged and, asking questions and writing comments. So that's really good. One last thing, there's one other person that I would like to thank is Dur, my colleague Durre, who we never see, but she is there hidden and making sure that everything works smoothly. So thank you, Durre, for staying with us today. Last thing, I want to ask you to please fill in the evaluation for this webinar to let us know if you really enjoyed it and if we can improve this. So now we will post the link in the chat. I will also, as I was mentioning earlier, we will publish the recording for this event, so you will find it. And thank you again to everyone for staying with us and for making this very interesting conversation possible. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye.